Cassian Valeon, a powerful executive worth millions, orchestrated a plan that defied all reason. He staged his own death to learn the truth about his wife. She had sworn to love him until her last breath. But when she thought he was finally gone, her true nature surfaced. The chapel was magnificent. White roses cascaded from crystal vases. Soft candlelight reflected off polished marble floors. Mourners in elegant black attire stood in respectful silence around the open casket. And there, draped over the body of Cassian Valeon, was his wife Aurelia, her crimson dress a stark, dramatic contrast against the sea of black, her sobs echoing through the hushed space. It looked like the funeral of a deeply loved man. But Cassian Valeon wasn't dead. He was watching from a hidden room 3 doors down, his eyes fixed on the surveillance monitor, his heart pounding as he observed every gesture, every tear, every theatrical gasp from the woman he'd married 5 years ago. Despite the empire he'd built, the executive suite overlooking the city, the investment portfolio that could sustain 3 generations, the properties in 4 countries, Cassian felt like the most impoverished man alive. All the wealth in the world meant nothing if the woman beside him saw only bank accounts where a heart should be. The doubts had crept in slowly, like poison. First came the whispers. Colleagues at corporate events, champagne glasses in hand, their voices just low enough to seem discreet but loud enough for him to hear. She targeted him specifically, you know. Calculated every move. It was never about love. Then came Aurelia's growing coldness. The way she'd dismiss his attempts at genuine conversation with a wave of her hand. How she'd schedule personal appointments that never appeared on their shared calendar. The distant look in her eyes when he talked about their future together, as if she was seeing through him to something else entirely. The financial irregularities started small. A transfer he didn't authorize. An account he didn't recognize. Bills for hotels in cities she claimed never to visit. When he questioned her, she'd smile that perfect smile and provide explanations so smooth, so rehearsed, they only deepened his suspicion. Then came the phone call he wasn't supposed to overhear. He'd returned home early from a business trip, walking through their penthouse toward his office, when he heard Aurelia's voice drifting from the bedroom. He's becoming paranoid lately, constantly checking the accounts, asking questions. It's tiresome. A pause. Then, no, not much longer. We just need to be patient. But what finally shattered any remaining hope was the text message. He'd picked up Aurelia's phone by accident one morning, they had the same model, and it had unlocked to an open conversation. The words were brief. Clinical. Devastating. Once he's gone, we'll have everything to ourselves. Just be patient. Most men would have called their lawyers. Filed for divorce. Protected their assets through the legal system and moved on with their lives. But Cassian didn't want legal protection. He didn't want a settlement. He wanted something no lawyer could provide, certainty. He needed to know, with absolute, irrefutable clarity, whether the woman he'd built his life around had ever loved him at all, or if every smile, every touch, every whispered promise had been nothing more than a performance designed to secure her financial future. So he made a choice that even he recognized as extreme. Desperate. Perhaps even unhinged. He would stage his own death. With the help of his sister Elena and a discreet physician named Dr. Marcus Hale, Cassian orchestrated an elaborate charade. A fatal car accident. Convincing medical reports. A body that would be identified but not examined too closely. An open casket wake to give Aurelia the perfect stage for her grief, real or performed. And then, while the city mourned the loss of one of its most successful businessmen, Cassian would watch. Hidden cameras throughout their home. A secure feed to his secret location. He would see everything Aurelia did when she believed no one was watching. He expected betrayal. He braced himself for greed. He anticipated watching her move quickly to access his accounts, perhaps even celebrate her newfound wealth with whatever partner she'd been texting. But what Cassian would witness went far beyond simple gold digging. What he would see wasn't just theft or opportunism. It was something so calculated, so utterly devoid of human warmth, so cruelly indifferent to everything they'd supposedly shared, that it wouldn't just expose a lie. It would break him completely. 5 years earlier, Cassian Valeon had believed he'd found everything. Their wedding had been featured in 3 luxury magazines. The reception at the Grandmont estate, fountains of champagne, orchids flown in from Singapore, a string quartet that had performed at royal weddings. Aurelia had moved through the crowd in her custom Valentino gown like she'd been born for that exact moment, her smile radiant, her hand warm in his. "You've made me the happiest woman alive," she'd whispered against his ear as they danced their first dance, and he believed every word. The penthouse had come next. 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering cityscape. Aurelia had decorated it herself, Italian marble, designer furniture, art pieces that cost more than most people's houses. She had impeccable taste. Everything had to be perfect. The right brands. The right addresses. The right people at their dinner parties. Cassian had worked 16-hour days to maintain it all. Mergers. Acquisitions. Board meetings that stretched past midnight. He'd built his empire from nothing, the son of a mechanic who'd clawed his way through business school and made his first million by 30. Every deal he closed, every contract he signed, he did it thinking of the life he was building for them. Aurelia had seemed proud of him then. She'd attend his corporate galas in gowns that turned heads, her arm linked through his, introducing herself as Mrs. Valeon, with a warmth that made his chest swell. She'd post carefully curated photos on social media, candlelit dinners, weekend getaways to Monaco, champagne toasts on their terrace at sunset. The perfect power couple. But perfection, Cassian would learn, required constant maintenance. Aurelia's shopping trips grew longer. Her friend circle expanded to include people he'd never met. She started working with a personal brand consultant, whatever that meant. New jewelry appeared in her collection. New charges on the credit cards. When he'd mention the spending, she'd laugh it off with that musical voice of hers. "Darling, you can't expect me to represent you looking anything less than extraordinary," she'd say, kissing his cheek. "Image is everything in your world. You know that." And he did know that. So he'd signed off on another credit increase, attended another charity gala where Aurelia dazzled in diamonds, and pushed aside the hollow feeling growing in his chest. He'd thought love looked like this. Opulence. Beauty. The envy of everyone around them. He'd been so desperately, tragically wrong. The shift happened so gradually that Cassian almost missed it. It started with the small things. Aurelia stopped asking about his day. When he'd come home exhausted from closing a major acquisition, eager to share the victory, she'd glance up from her phone with a distracted, "That's wonderful, darling," before returning to her screen. The warmth in her eyes, the thing that had made him fall for her in the first place, had dimmed to polite interest. Their dinners together became shorter. She'd eat quickly, checking her phone between bites, then excuse herself to take calls in the other room. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt like pulling teeth. He'd ask about her day and receive one-word answers. He'd suggest a weekend away and she'd cite prior commitments he'd never heard about. The bedroom grew colder too. She'd turn away from him at night, citing headaches or exhaustion. When he'd reach for her hand across the silk sheets, she'd give it a perfunctory squeeze before pulling away. "Are we okay?" he'd asked one evening, the question hanging in the air of their pristine living room. Aurelia had looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Of course. Why wouldn't we be? Then she'd returned to scrolling through her tablet, dismissing his concern as easily as swatting away a fly. The first real evidence came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Cassian had been reviewing their joint account statements over coffee, something he did quarterly, more out of habit than necessity. His eyes had snagged on a transaction he didn't recognize. $15,000, transferred to an account number he'd never seen before. No memo. No explanation. He'd stared at it for a full minute, his coffee growing cold. Then he'd found another. $22,000, 3 weeks prior. Same unknown account. His hands had started to shake as he scrolled further back. There were more. Small transfers at first, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, then escalating. All to the same mysterious destination. When he'd pulled up the previous month's credit card statements, his breath had caught. The Peninsula Hotel. 5 nights. He'd been in Singapore that week for a conference. Aurelia had stayed home, or so she'd said. He'd sat there in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, and felt the foundation of his life begin to crack. Cassian spent the next 3 weeks in quiet agony, watching Aurelia move through their home like a stranger wearing his wife's face. He said nothing about the transfers. Nothing about the hotel bill. He played the role of the oblivious husband while his mind worked overtime, cataloging every suspicious glance, every unexplained absence, every too smooth lie. He told himself he was being paranoid. That there had to be a reasonable explanation. That the woman he'd married couldn't possibly be. The thought died every time he looked at their bank statements. Then came the morning that shattered whatever fragile hope remained. He'd woken early for a dawn conference call with Tokyo. The penthouse was still dark, Aurelia asleep in their bed. He'd grabbed his phone from the nightstand and padded quietly to his office. But halfway down the hall, he'd realized he'd picked up the wrong phone. Again. They had the same model, the same black case. An easy mistake. He'd turned back to swap them, but the screen had lit up with an incoming message. His thumb had brushed the notification, and the phone had unlocked. She'd never changed her passcode from their anniversary, opening directly to an active conversation. The contact name was simply J. Cassian's eyes had frozen on the most recent message, time-stamped from 3 hours earlier. Once he's gone, we'll have everything to ourselves. Just be patient. His blood had turned to ice. He'd scrolled up with trembling fingers. Days of messages. Weeks. Planning. Scheming. References to the life insurance policy, and after the accident, and making it look natural. One message from Aurelia, sent just 2 days ago, he suspects something about the transfers. We need to move faster. I'm thinking next month. The ski trip to Aspen. Jay's response, perfect. Mountain accidents happen all the time. No one will question it. Cassian had stood there in the darkened hallway, phone clutched in his shaking hand, the world tilting beneath his feet. This wasn't about divorce. This wasn't about taking half his fortune in a settlement. Aurelia wasn't planning to leave him. She was planning to kill him. The phone had nearly slipped from his grip as the full weight of it crashed over him. Every smile had been a lie. Every kiss had been calculation. Every whispered, I love you, had been nothing more than a predator keeping her prey close. And he'd suspected betrayal, expected greed, but this was something else entirely. This was murder. Cassian had driven to Elena's house at 6 in the morning, the screenshots burned into his phone, his hand still shaking on the steering wheel. His sister had opened the door in her robe, taken one look at his face, and pulled him inside without a word. By the time he'd finished explaining, showing her the messages, the transfers, the entire conspiracy laid bare, Elena's expression had shifted from shock to cold fury. "We're calling the police," she'd said, reaching for her phone. "And tell them what?" Cassian's voice had come out hollow. "That my wife is planning to kill me based on text messages that could be explained away as dark jokes. That I accessed her phone without permission. Elena, she's been planning this for months. She'll have covered her tracks. Her lawyers will bury me in litigation while she moves the money offshore and disappears." Elena had stared at him, her jaw tight. "So what do you want to do?" That's when the idea had crystallized, desperate, insane, but brutally elegant. "I want to die," he'd said quietly. "Before she can kill me, I want to die." His sister had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. But as he'd explained the plan, her expression had shifted to something darker. Understanding. Agreement. They'd brought in Dr. Marcus Hale that same afternoon, Elena's former colleague, a man whose discretion was absolute and whose medical expertise was unquestionable. The three of them had sat in Elena's living room, voices low, plotting something that would either expose Aurelia completely or destroy Cassian in the process. A car accident, Marcus had suggested, his fingers steepled. Trauma severe enough to justify a closed investigation, but circumstances that allow for an open casket. "I can forge the death certificate. I know the right people at the morgue." "She needs to believe it's real," Cassian had said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "Completely real. Which means everyone believes it. The press. Our friends. Even my own employees." Elena had leaned forward. "And you'll watch her. Document everything she does when she thinks you're gone." "I've been recording for 3 months, Cassian had admitted, pulling out a second phone, his secret device, the one Aurelia knew nothing about. "Audio surveillance in every room of the penthouse. Video in my office and the bedroom. I have her on tape discussing the transfers with whoever this J person is." Marcus had whistled low. "You've been preparing for this." "I've been trying to prove myself wrong," Cassian had corrected, his voice breaking slightly. "I wanted evidence that I was paranoid. That I was seeing shadows where there was only light." The silence that followed had been answer enough. They'd spent 2 weeks choreographing his death with the precision of a surgical operation. Marcus had secured a body, a John Doe from the city morgue, similar build and age, dead from an overdose with no family to claim him. "The facial trauma will be severe enough to obscure identification," he'd explained, clinical and detached. "Dental records will match because I'll make sure they match. The autopsy will be cursory at best, wealthy businessmen, tragic accident, clear cause of death. No one looks too closely." The accident itself would happen on Route 47, a winding mountain road Cassian drove every month to visit a manufacturing plant. At 11:30 on a Tuesday night, his car, rigged by Elena's ex-husband, a mechanic who owed her favors and asked no questions, would veer off the guardrail and tumble down a steep embankment. The police would find it at dawn. The body inside would be unrecognizable but identifiable through documentation. Dr. Marcus Hale would be the attending physician, confirming the death, signing the certificate, ensuring the narrative held. "The wake will be in 3 days, Elena had said, reviewing the timeline. "Open casket, you insisted on it in your will, remember? You wanted people to say goodbye properly." Cassian had nodded, the irony bitter on his tongue. The will he'd updated 6 months ago, when Aurelia had suggested it during a romantic dinner. "Just to be responsible, darling," she'd said. How thorough she'd been. How patient. The viewing room had been established in a vacant office 3 doors down from the chapel, part of the same building complex his company owned. Marcus had installed the surveillance feed, linking every camera in the funeral home directly to the monitors. High definition. Multiple angles. Audio so clear Cassian would hear every whisper. Now, sitting in that darkened room, Cassian watched the monitors flicker to life. The chapel filled with mourners. The casket, his casket, positioned at the center, surrounded by white roses and flickering candles. And then Aurelia arrived. She wore red. Not black like the others, but a deep crimson dress that clung to her figure, making her impossible to miss. Bold. Dramatic. The grieving widow who refused to hide her pain in somber colors. She'd thought of everything, Cassian realized with a sick feeling in his stomach. Even her outfit was calculated for maximum impact. She approached the casket slowly, her steps measured, her hand rising to her mouth. And then she collapsed against it, her sobs echoing through the chapel, her body shaking with what looked like genuine anguish. Cassian's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen. The performance had begun. The news had broken at dawn, before Cassian's body was even cold in the morgue. Tragic accident claims life of business mogul Cassian Valeon, the headlines screamed. The footage showed his mangled car being lifted from the ravine, emergency lights painting the mountainside in red and blue. Reporters spoke in hushed, respectful tones about his legacy, his philanthropy, his promising future cut short at 38. By noon, the story had gone national. Aurelia's first public appearance had been perfectly timed, stepping out of their penthouse building at 2 in the afternoon, flanked by 2 friends, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Photographers had swarmed. She'd paused at the car door, her hand pressed to her heart and delivered a single, trembling sentence, "He was everything to me." The image had been on every news site within the hour. The devastated widow. The woman who'd lost her world. Now, at the wake, she was delivering the performance of a lifetime. Cassian watched through the monitor as she draped herself over the casket, her crimson dress a slash of color against the white satin lining. Her sobs were raw, desperate, the kind that made every mourner in the chapel shift uncomfortably and look away, as if witnessing something too intimate for public consumption. "I can't do this," she wailed, her voice breaking. "I can't say goodbye. Not yet. Not ever." Elena was there, standing near the back with her arms crossed, her face a mask of composed grief. She met Aurelia's eyes once across the chapel, and Cassian saw his sister's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She knew. She was watching the same performance he was, seeing the same calculated theatrics. But everyone else was convinced. Cassian's business partners stood in clusters, their expressions somber. His assistant was openly crying. Even the priest looked moved by Aurelia's display of raw emotion. She touched the body's face, the stranger's face that everyone believed was Cassian's, with trembling fingers. "You promised me forever," she whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "You promised we'd grow old together. How could you leave me like this?" The gasps of sympathy rippled through the crowd. A colleague approached, placing a gentle hand on Aurelia's shoulder. She turned into the embrace, burying her face against the woman's chest, her shoulders heaving. The colleague stroked her hair, murmuring words of comfort, while others nodded in understanding. Cassian felt bile rise in his throat. She was magnificent. Every gesture precisely calibrated. Every tear strategically placed. She'd even chosen the dress to ensure she'd stand out in every photograph, every news clip, every memory of this day. The grieving widow in red, destroyed by the loss of her beloved husband. It was flawless. It was monstrous. The hours dragged like years. Cassian sat in the darkness of his hidden room, eyes burning from staring at the monitors, watching mourner after mourner pay their respects to a dead man who wasn't dead. The disconnect between what they believed and what he knew created a surreal, nauseating vertigo. His former mentor, Richard Chen, stood at the casket for a full 5 minutes, his weathered hand resting on the edge. Cassian watched the old man's lips move in what might have been a prayer or a memory. Richard had given him his first real job, had believed in him when he was nobody. The grief on his face was real, carved deep into every line. Cassian's throat tightened. His cousin James arrived with his wife and children. The kids, 8 and 10, stared at the casket with wide, confused eyes. The youngest started crying, and James lifted her into his arms, his own face crumbling as he tried to comfort her. "Uncle Cassian loved you so much," he whispered into her hair. "He loved you so much." Cassian had to look away from the screen. This was the cost he hadn't fully calculated. Not just Aurelia's performance, but the genuine pain of everyone who'd actually cared about him. Every person in that chapel was suffering real loss, real grief, while he hid in the shadows orchestrating their anguish. What kind of man does this? He thought, horror creeping through his chest. What kind of man puts his family through a funeral to catch his wife? But then his eyes drifted back to Aurelia, and the answer crystallized with cruel clarity: a man married to a woman planning his murder. She'd moved through the chapel like a tragic heroine, accepting condolences with trembling grace. She'd embraced his mother, who looked 10 years older than she had a week ago, and whispered something that made the older woman break down completely. Aurelia held her, stroking her back, her face the picture of shared devastation. Elena caught it too. Cassian saw his sister's expression harden as she watched Aurelia comfort their mother, saw the way Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The chapel began to empty as evening fell. Mourners filtered out in quiet clusters, their voices hushed, their faces drawn. The priest offered final blessings. Staff began dimming lights in the adjacent rooms. But Aurelia remained. She stood alone at the casket now, her back to the departing crowd, one hand resting on the polished wood. From a distance, she looked like a woman unable to let go. Cassian leaned forward, his pulse quickening. The last mourner left. The chapel door clicked shut. And Aurelia's shoulders straightened. Aurelia waited exactly 30 seconds after the door closed. Then she straightened fully, rolled her shoulders like an actress stepping off stage, and checked her phone. The transformation was instantaneous. The trembling grief, the raw emotion, the devastated widow, all of it vanished as completely as if someone had flipped a switch. Her face smoothed into an expression of cool calculation as she scrolled through her messages, her thumb moving with casual efficiency. Cassian's breath caught in his chest. She glanced at the casket one final time, not with sorrow, but with something closer to satisfaction, then turned and walked toward the chapel's side entrance. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with sharp, purposeful strikes. No more shuffling steps of grief. No more theatrical pauses. She pulled out her phone again and made a call. "It's done," she said, her voice clear and businesslike through the audio feed. Everyone bought it completely. Even his mother. A pause, then a sound that made Cassian's blood freeze: laughter. Brief, dismissive, utterly devoid of warmth. "God, I thought she'd never stop crying. 5 hours of that performance nearly killed me." Cassian's hands gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. Aurelia pushed through the side door into a private lounge, one of the rooms reserved for family. Cassian switched camera angles, watching as she dropped into a leather chair and kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. "The estate documents are already in motion," she continued into the phone. His lawyer will read the will tomorrow. Everything transfers to me as primary beneficiary, the penthouse, the accounts, the investment portfolio. We just need to wait the standard processing period. Another pause. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then we're free. She stood and moved to a mirror, checking her reflection, smoothing her hair. The woman staring back bore no resemblance to the shattered widow who'd collapsed over the casket an hour earlier. "Meet me at the penthouse tonight," Aurelia said, her voice dropping lower, more intimate. "Midnight. Everyone will be gone by then. We can finally celebrate properly." Cassian watched her smile, a real smile, nothing like the trembling expressions she'd worn all day. This smile was sharp, victorious, predatory. 5 years, she said softly, speaking to whoever was on the other end of that call. 5 years of playing the perfect wife. Of pretending to care about his boring business stories and his pathetic need for validation. But it's finally over, Jay. We did it. She ended the call and turned back toward the chapel, her expression settling into something Cassian had never seen before. Pure, cold triumph. Cassian had expected greed. He'd braced himself for callousness. But he wasn't prepared for what came next. The chapel door opened again, and a man entered. Tall, well-dressed, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. It took Cassian 3 seconds to place him, Julian Martinez, one of the mourners from earlier. He'd stood in the back row, his expression appropriately somber, his black suit impeccable. Aurelia turned toward him, and her face lit up with an expression Cassian had never seen her wear. Not for him. Not once in 5 years. Pure, unguarded joy. Julian crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. She melted against him, her fingers curling into his jacket, and they kissed with the desperate hunger of 2 people who'd been forced to maintain distance for far too long. When they finally broke apart, Julian cupped her face in his hands. "You were incredible today. I almost believed you myself." Aurelia laughed, a real laugh, bright and genuine. "I deserve an Oscar for that performance. Did you see his mother? The way she clung to me?" She shook her head, still smiling. "God, the things I endured for this moment." "It's over now," Julian murmured, pressing his forehead to hers. "No more pretending. No more playing the devoted wife to a man who actually thought I loved him," Aurelia finished, stepping back with a look of incredulous amusement. "Can you imagine? 5 years, and he never once suspected. He was so desperate to believe someone could love him for more than his money." She paused, then added with casual cruelty, "So pathetically desperate." The words hit Cassian like physical blows. Julian pulled her close again. "What did you ever see in him?" $42 million in liquid assets, Aurelia said without hesitation. "A property portfolio worth another 60. Investment accounts that generate more passive income than most people make in a lifetime." She smiled up at Julian. "I saw exactly what I needed to see. And now it's all yours." "Ours," she corrected, kissing him again. "Every single penny. We just have to wait for the paperwork to clear, and then we disappear. Monaco, like we planned. New identities. New lives." Julian's expression darkened slightly. "You're sure he never suspected? Never found the messages? Cassian?" Aurelia laughed again, the sound echoing through the empty chapel. "He was too busy trying to prove he was worthy of love to notice he'd married someone incapable of giving it. The man built an empire but couldn't see the snake in his own bed." She glanced back at the casket one final time, her smile turning cold. "Good riddance to the fool." Cassian felt something inside him shatter completely. Cassian waited until they'd moved to the estate documents, until Aurelia had pulled the folder from her bag and spread the papers across the table, her finger tracing the beneficiary lines while Julian leaned over her shoulder, both of them smiling like children on Christmas morning. Then he stood, turned off the monitors, and walked out of the hidden room. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, but his mind was crystalline clear. He'd gotten exactly what he'd orchestrated this entire nightmare to obtain: irrefutable proof. Video evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Aurelia's own words condemning her completely. Victory should have tasted sweet. Instead, it tasted like ash. He pushed open the chapel door. The sound made both of them freeze. Aurelia's head snapped up, her eyes widening as Cassian stepped into the candlelight, very much alive, his face an expressionless mask. "Hello, Aurelia." The folder slipped from her hands. Papers scattered across the floor. Julian stumbled backward, his face draining of color. But Cassian kept his eyes on his wife, his widow, who'd buried him 3 hours ago, and watched every emotion flicker across her features. Shock. Disbelief. Then, finally, the horrible understanding of what had just happened. "You," her voice came out strangled. "You're supposed to be dead?" Cassian finished. "Yes, I know. That was rather the point." He held up his phone, the one that contained every recorded second of the past 6 hours. "I wanted to see what you'd do when you thought I was gone. Who you really were when the performance ended." Aurelia's face went white. "Cassian, I can explain." "Good riddance to the fool," he quoted back at her, his voice flat. "That's what you said 42 seconds ago. Would you like to hear the recording?" Julian made a move toward the door. Cassian didn't even glance at him. "Elena called the police 20 minutes ago. They're waiting outside with arrest warrants for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. I'd suggest staying put." The chapel doors opened. Officers filed in, Elena behind them, her expression grim with satisfaction. Marcus followed, medical documents in hand, the real ones, the ones that would prove the elaborate deception and, more importantly, prove why it had been necessary. Cassian watched as they handcuffed Aurelia, read her rights, led her toward the door. She looked back at him once, her face contorted with rage and fear, and opened her mouth to speak. He turned away before she could. 3 weeks later, Cassian stood in his penthouse, secured, assets protected, estate intact. The legal proceedings were already underway. Aurelia and Julian would face decades in prison. He'd won. But as he stared out at the glittering city below, all he felt was the devastating emptiness of a man who'd proven, beyond any doubt, that he'd never been loved at all. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next story.